Can you believe that a simple sunset could become a global catastrophe? We are talking about a place where the air itself tries to kill you, a silent, invisible assassin that patrolled the highest point on Earth, the very crown of our planet, the Tibetan Plateau, circa 300 BCE.
Imagine climbing so high that the stars stop twinkling and instead burn with a cold, terrifying intensity, feeling closer than the ground beneath your feet. This was not a mountain range. This was another planet, dropped onto the edge of Asia, a hostile, breathtaking, beautiful death trap. We call it the roof of the world, but for the unfortunate souls who dared to wander its staggering 16,000-foot average elevation, it was simply the waiting room of the underworld. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to face a catastrophe no one saw coming, an enemy whose weapon was absolute zero.
Human beings, lacking modern gear, lacking insulated tents, lacking even basic meteorological understanding, somehow managed to colonize this desolate, frozen nightmare. The story you are about to hear is not about explorers discovering a new land. It is about a handful of desperate people discovering how to defy the laws of physics itself, armed with nothing but desperate ingenuity and the fierce primal need to see the next sunrise. Our saga begins not with a roar, but with a whisper, the subtle, terrifying sound of the sun setting on the high plain. During the day, the intensity of the solar radiation was a brutal blessing, scorching the skin while offering a brief, fleeting warmth. The world was alive, treacherous, but survivable. But then came the hour of the shadow, the moment that monstrous orange orb dipped below the jagged horizon. The plateau didn't just get cold. It entered a state of cryogenic warfare. The temperature didn't drop incrementally. It fell off a cliff. We're talking about a swing of 40, 50, sometimes 60 degrees Fahrenheit in a matter of minutes. This wasn't weather. This was a weaponized environmental collapse. The exposed stone, heated to a deceptive warmth only moments before, suddenly began sucking the heat out of everything it touched, turning into a thermal vampire, demanding a terrible toll. The settlers, a small, resilient group known for their tenacity in the lower valleys, had made a monumental mistake. They had underestimated the scale of the cold. They had thought their heavy fur cloaks and their practiced campfires, which had kept them safe through countless winter nights below, would be enough to hold back the tide of the Himalayan frost. They were catastrophically wrong. The air, already thin enough to leave their lungs gasping like netted fish, now began to steal the life force directly from their bodies with shocking efficiency. The sheer lack of atmospheric density meant that any heat generated immediately radiated away into the vast, open blackness of space above them. It was like trying to fill a bucket that had no bottom. Every calorie they burned, every spark they ignited, was a momentary flare against an overwhelming, eternal dark. Imagine the scene, the first night of high-altitude survival. The men huddled around a sputtering fire, their faces lit by the desperate flames, but their backs already turning rigid with the encroaching ice. They watched in horror as the meager water they had collected froze solid, not slowly, but in minutes, locking the precious liquid into a useless crystal tomb. Their breath crystallized instantly, forming plumes of icy smoke that hung heavy in the frigid, still air. This was a cold so deep, so penetrating, that it didn't just hurt the skin. It seized the muscles, slowing the blood, and creeping toward the very core organs, aiming for the final, fatal shutdown. They quickly realized the terrible truth. Their traditional fires were a joke. A single, contained blaze was utterly insufficient to heat the vast, open volume of air that surrounded them. The heat simply vanished, swallowed by the altitude.
Panic began to set in, a silent, paralyzing dread, far more dangerous than the cold itself. Fingers went numb, then white, then painfully black. The hypoxia, the lack of oxygen that already clouded their judgment, now worked in tandem with the cold, convincing their bodies that sleep was the only option, a soft, seductive lie leading straight to hypothermia and death.
The elders, the seasoned survivors who had seen every valley storm and mountain lion attack, stood paralyzed, watching their families shiver violently, realizing that the conventional rules of survival no longer applied. They were not fighting winter. They were fighting the vacuum of space, brought down to ground level. They were losing precious resources, wood, energy, and most critically, time. If they didn't invent a new way to live by dawn, none of them would see it. Their salvation, however, wasn't going to come from a single heroic fire, but from a profound understanding of layers, material, and a radical transformation of their entire approach to surviving the night. This realization, born in the agonizing grip of sub-zero terror, would forge the very identity of the people who came to call the roof of the world home. It was the moment that simple layered clothing became a shield against annihilation, and fire became an art form of desperate, controlled, continuous combustion. Get ready, because what happened next redefined human endurance and unlocked the secret to thriving where everything else was destined to freeze solid. This is the story of how they cheated the glacial hand of the ancient Tibetan night. The chilling truth, the one that shattered their very notion of safety, was this. On the roof of the world, fire itself betrayed them. They heaped dry yak dung and sparse scrubwood into roaring pyres, convinced that sheer volume of flame could conquer this 16,000-foot terror. But the plateau is a silent assassin of physics. At that extreme altitude, the air is starved, thin, and desperate. Every breath the fire tried to take was meager, meaning combustion was incomplete, inefficient, and agonizingly weak. The flames that looked so fierce were merely a cruel illusion, radiating a pathetic fraction of the heat they would offer at sea level. The heat simply vanished, sucked away by the immense hyperconductive cold before it could even kiss their skin. It was like trying to stop a tidal wave with a straw. Every time the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, They entered the critical zone, a time known locally as the hour of the vultures, when the temperature didn't just drop, it plummeted, an unstoppable, lethal freefall into the negative abyss. Their bodies, already struggling just to filter the vanishing oxygen from the atmosphere, were forced to dedicate every spare calorie not to survival tasks, but to the futile effort of shivering. This was the hypoxia trap. The lack of air meant their minds fogged, their coordination failed, and they lacked the mental clarity to fix the problem, even as the cold gripped their throats. They were caught in a catastrophic feedback loop, where the cold exacerbated the altitude sickness, and the altitude sickness stripped them of the ability to fight the cold. The heavy hides and dense woolen cloaks they had worn for generations, artifacts of lower altitude warfare, were suddenly their greatest weakness.
These thick, weighty layers demanded too much energy to carry and maneuver. Worse, the exertion caused them to sweat. And that moisture, that liquid betrayal, turned their meticulously crafted insulation into sheets of frozen, body-contacting ice.
The external wind, howling like a vengeful deity, tore through the thick fabric, using the trapped moisture as a direct conduit to extract every single joule of warmth from their core. They weren't just freezing, they were being systematically refrigerated by their own failed technology. This realization was the genesis of their revolution. They had to stop fighting the cold and start manipulating the air itself. Their breakthrough wasn't about adding more fuel to the fire. It was about redefining what clothing meant, transforming it from a protective blanket into a custom-engineered, multi-stage thermal reactor.
They realized that the true enemy wasn't the temperature. It was the wind and the moisture. To survive, they needed air pockets, thousands of tiny insulated bubbles, not dense, suffocating mass. The first layer, the skin layer, became their sacrifice layer. They sourced the finest, softest undercoat of the Himalayan mountain goats, a silk-like fiber that had the miraculous property of actively wicking moisture away from the skin.
This thin, almost translucent material was designed to get damp so that their skin stayed bone dry, stopping the immediate, lethal transfer of conductive heat loss. This single, counterintuitive step, wearing the lightest layer closest to the body, cheated the cold of its most effective weapon. The second layer was the masterpiece, the loft. They used meticulously prepared and cleaned down from certain high-altitude waterfowl and mixed it with loosely carded yak wool to create maximum dead air space. This layer wasn't heavy, it was voluminous, a pressurized envelope of static, insulating air. This was the insulation that truly mattered, trapping the small amount of body heat they could generate, and creating a thermal barrier so effective that the external temperature became irrelevant. It was like wearing a perpetual, personal microclimate. Finally, the third layer, the shell of defiance, was tough, treated leather, often goat or antelope due to its lighter weight compared to yak hide, saturated with rendered animal fat or oil. This was their wind and water barrier, a carapace against the catastrophic gusts that could pierce any traditional garment. This three-layered system, wick, loft, shell, was a radical departure, a biological feat of engineering that allowed them to move with relative freedom while maintaining core temperatures. But the clothing was only half the battle. They still had to sleep, and they still needed fire. They conquered the inefficiency of the high-altitude fire, not by building it bigger, but by containing it entirely. They dug deep, insulated earthen pits within their temporary shelters, lining them with specific heat-retaining river stones, a natural thermal mass. The fire was contained within this pit, concentrating the meager heat output, and the stones became massive heat sinks. Once heated, these smooth, obsidian-like rocks were wrapped tightly in dry felt and placed strategically near the sleeping arrangement. The fire could be allowed to dwindle, starved of oxygen once they were asleep, but the stones would radiate gentle, life-saving heat for hours, long enough to bridge the gap between sunset and the pre-dawn nadir of cold. They had effectively invented portable, rechargeable heating units, turning geology into their most reliable survival tool. This combination of advanced physiological layering and calculated thermal mass management transformed the impossible into the merely agonizing. They no longer simply endured the night. They had begun to manipulate it, using the very ground beneath them and the air around them to construct their own survivable reality. But surviving the night was one thing. Surviving the journey, the relentless day-after-day trek across the world's harshest terrain, demanded an entirely different level of calculated risk and sheer, terrifying will. The true test of their revolution was yet to come. Could their fragile, human-engineered ecosystem withstand the crushing psychological and physical demands of perpetual motion in the death zone? The next blizzard would provide the brutal answer. The answer came not as a whisper. The answer came not as a whisper, but as a tectonic roar. The wind arrived like a fist made of frozen granite, slamming into their meager camp at speeds that defied the very concept of shelter. This wasn't weather. It was a siege orchestrated by the mountain gods themselves, determined to grind human bone into the high-altitude dust. The moment the first gust hit, the temperature didn't just drop, it plummeted into the killing zone, instantly vaporizing any lingering hope that simple heavy skins could offer protection. They were standing naked against the raw vacuum of space, protected only by the ingenuity they had desperately woven into their gear. In this oxygen-starved arena, the wind chill factor wasn't a calculation. It was a ticking clock leading to complete organ failure. Every breath was a needle of ice carving its way through their lungs, stealing the precious, thin air they needed just to fuel their trembling muscles. Their chief terror, the insidious killer known as hypoxia, suddenly partnered with the gale. The physical effort required just to lean into the wind, to stay upright and prevent being hurled off the ridge, doubled their oxygen consumption, accelerating the brain fog and the fatal slide toward lethargy. They had anticipated the static cold of the night,
the slow, creeping paralysis that locks joints into permanent stillness. But the wind was a different beast, an active, malicious entity ripping the thin boundary layer of warmth they generated from their bodies, exposing the skin directly to the -40 oblivion. There was no hiding, only enduring. This is where their desperate gamble on the layered defense had to pay off, a concept so radical for 300 BCE that it felt like magic. They weren't wearing a single thick, monolithic hide anymore. They were encased in systems, moving parts designed to manage the invisible war against moisture and conductivity. The inner layer, soft, carefully combed yak undercoat, the ultimate moisture-wicking defense. It was designed not primarily to warm, but to isolate the sweat, the silent killer that turns traditional, warm clothing into deadly, highly conductive sheaths of ice the moment movement ceases. The middle layers, densely woven wool and felt, meticulously layered to trap pockets of air. Air, when held still, is the greatest insulator known to man, and they were trying to build a static bubble of warmth in the heart of a continental hurricane. And the outer shell, thick, specially treated yak leather, tanned with specific oils to remain flexible even in sub-zero temperatures, forming a rudimentary yet critical wind-proof membrane. It was cumbersome, demanding immense effort to move, but it bought them the milliseconds they needed to survive the continuous assault of the wind shear. But the clothing was only half the equation in this insane thermodynamics problem. The fire, their fragile, eternal god, was dying. The wind screamed down the valley like a colossal bellows, simultaneously consuming the available oxygen and scattering the precious, slow-burning yak dung fuel across the ice. The heart of their camp was the fire pit, now a flickering, terrifying ember struggling against absolute annihilation. They had learned months ago that a large, roaring fire was a liability here. It was unsustainable, consumed too much oxygen, and broadcasted its heat too quickly into the atmosphere for minimal benefit. Their innovation, born of starvation and frostbite, was the trench fire pit. A deep, narrow excavation, carefully lined with stones, designed to draw oxygen from the earth below the permafrost line and shield the flame from the lateral wind shear above. It minimized thermal loss and maximized the terrifyingly finite fuel efficiency. This wasn't about generating massive warmth. It was about maintaining a constant, small source of radiant heat, enough to prevent core temperature catastrophic failure, and, crucially, to melt the snow they desperately needed for water. Dehydration was just as lethal and often faster than hypothermia up here. As the blizzard raged, the team had to engage in the most counterintuitive action possible: perpetual movement. Standing still meant immediate surrender to the cold that would creep into the joints and lock them into position forever. They had to maintain the survival dance, stamping their feet, swinging their arms, performing continuous low-impact work in the pitch black. Fear became their only sustained fuel, Every exhausted nerve ending screamed in protest, demanding they curl up and submit to the sweet, merciful release of the cold embrace. But their minds, honed by weeks of high-altitude terror, recognized that lethal invitation immediately and fought against it with the primal ferocity of cornered beasts. A man named Kalen, their designated firekeeper and a master of the scarce fuel economy, struggled toward the collapsing fuel supply. He moved like an automaton, his face a mask of rime ice, his eyes burning with the singular, desperate focus required to keep the flame of civilization from extinguishing entirely. He knew that if the fire died, the water would freeze solid in minutes. The careful insulation in their clothes would become hopelessly compromised, and the psychological fortress they had built against the void would crumble into instant chaotic panic. The fire was the heartbeat of their existence, and he was the desperate surgeon keeping it alive. The blizzard lasted for what felt like 10,000 years, hours bleeding into each other, marked only by the agonizing sound of the wind tearing at their makeshift rock shelters. They had survived the initial annihilating shock, but the real enemy now was the profound, inescapable exhaustion that followed the adrenaline spike. As the first terrible dawn finally broke, a weak, watery light struggling through the swirling, residual snow, Kalen looked at the fuel cache. It was critically, devastatingly low. They had survived the night, but now they faced the agonizing truth. Their meticulously engineered system was running on fumes, and the cold was not done with them. They had evaded the Reaper by sacrificing their future resources. The high-altitude death zone had merely shifted its strategy from immediate annihilation to slow, calculated depletion. The next few hours, exposed and starving for warmth, would be the most treacherous yet, forcing them into a desperate, unprecedented journey toward the next ridgeline, knowing that every single step was a calculated risk of absolute, final failure. The sun, which had been their only fleeting ally in the brutal dawn, now hung in the sky like a gilded promise of betrayal. Every step they took across the unforgiving scree of the high plateau was an argument with gravity itself, a negotiation where the price of failure was immediate, irreversible death. Their lungs, already burning from the thin, poisoned air, felt like sacks of crushed charcoal, demanding oxygen that simply did not exist in the necessary quantities at this crushing altitude. The mere act of lifting a foot, a simple, reflexive action anywhere else on Earth, became an exhaustive, deliberate calculation of fuel expenditure. They were moving in slow motion, not by choice, but because their muscles were starved, screaming for the life force that the atmosphere refused to deliver. This wasn't hiking. It was an involuntary self-suffocation ritual played out against a backdrop of terrifying, eternal blue. The weaponized cold of the night was replaced by the weaponized emptiness of the day. The air pressure was so low that it seemed to actively suck the moisture and warmth from their bodies, leaving them desiccated shells struggling to move. Their minds, the last bastions of their identity, began to fray. Hallucinations flickered at the edges of their peripheral vision. Phantom streams, impossible shelters, faces of loved ones, momentarily appearing in the jagged, dark rock formations. This was the Plateau's cruelest trick, making them doubt the reality they were sacrificing everything to preserve. They knew, intellectually, that the confusion was the high sickness, the altitude eating away at the very processing centers of the brain. But knowing the enemy does not always grant the power to defeat it. It only makes the surrender more terrifyingly lucid. The ridgeline, their promised sanctuary, remained agonizingly distant, a sharp black scar against the blinding white snowfields. Every upward trajectory was paid for with a debt of fatigue that could never be fully repaid. The ground beneath their rough, inadequate boots was a mosaic of loose shale and insidious, hidden ice patches, polished smooth by millennia of wind. A single misplaced step, a moment of dizzying imbalance caused by the lack of oxygen, could send one of them tumbling down thousands of feet of unforgiving stone. They walked with the unnatural stiffness of men made of brittle glass, every motion carefully measured, every breath a prayer offered to the void. The plateau demanded meticulous reverence for its physical laws, and deviation was punished instantly, brutally. Even the sound of their own footsteps was muffled, swallowed by the vast, silent expanse, reinforcing the terrifying sense of absolute isolation. And then there was the sun. High-altitude sunlight is not the warm, nurturing source of life known in the valleys. Here, it is a focused, lethal energy beam. The atmosphere filtered nothing, allowing raw, unfiltered UV radiation to bombard them relentlessly. Their faces were cracked and bleeding. The exposed skin blistered beyond recognition. But the greatest threat was to their sight. The blinding reflectivity of the snowfields, a shimmering, malevolent silver, threatened to burn the very pictures from their eyes. Snow blindness, the terrible consequence of prolonged exposure, was a slow, agonizing descent into temporary darkness, an outcome that meant certain, fatal vulnerability in this extreme environment. They had wrapped their faces in strips of blackened yak wool, a primitive but essential attempt to mimic protective lenses, squinting against the relentless glare that washed out all definition. Discipline became the only currency that mattered. They implemented the brutal, agonizing rhythm taught to them by generations of high desert traders, the rest step. It wasn't merely walking. It was a physical meditation on minimal effort. 1 foot forward, lock the knee instantly. Hang the entire weight of the body on that skeletal structure for 1 full breath, allowing the muscle a fraction of second of rest, and then push off with the rear foot. It was a pace that felt unnaturally slow, maddeningly inefficient to their desperate, racing minds. But it was the only way to cheat the muscle-wasting effects of the altitude. They moved like automatons, mechanical men, driven by sheer, desperate will, conserving energy with a fanaticism that bordered on religious devotion. Every unnecessary gesture, every wasted breath was a deposit into the bank of death. As they finally began the final, steep ascent towards the designated ridge, the point they hoped would offer both shelter from the wind and a better vantage for fuel spotting, a catastrophic shift occurred. The sky, which had been a clear, terrifying blue, suddenly began to curdle at the western horizon. A fast-moving, iron-gray front was barreling toward them, a visible, tangible wall of atmospheric rage. The plateau was not done tormenting them. It was simply escalating the difficulty. The wind, previously a manageable, steady blast, began to howl through the gorges below with a sound like tearing silk.
They knew this wind. It was the precursor to the whiteout, the blizzard that could materialize within minutes, dropping the effective temperature 30 degrees in a heartbeat and erasing the entire world in a vortex of stinging ice particles. They had mere moments now.
They pushed themselves past the point of endurance, staggering the last few 100 feet to the crest. The wind hit them instantly, a physical blow that nearly tore their layered yak-skin garments right off their backs.
They weren't seeking shelter on the ridge. They were seeking the leeward side, the precious razor-thin margin of safety that offered protection from the direct assault of the gale. Survival was a continuous exercise in finding the eye of the storm. The next few hours, huddled against the unyielding stone, praying the meager fuel they carried would be enough to hold back the inevitable deep freeze of the oncoming night, would determine whether the long, agonizing march had been a path to salvation or merely a delayed route to the grave. The plateau was tightening its terrible grip. The sun didn't set. It was abruptly and violently extinguished. One moment, the razor-thin light was slicing across the peaks. The next, it was gone, swallowed by an obsidian curtain that dropped the ambient temperature faster than a falling axe into soft wood. The plateau didn't transition into night. It initiated a lethal, immediate strike against life itself. The air itself became brittle, crackling with the violent compression of the cold. They had built their meager wall of yak dung and piled stones, a pathetic shield against a meteorological titan that cared nothing for their primitive fortifications. It offered protection from the wind, yes, but the wind was merely the plateau's messenger. The true killer was the silent, omnipresent void of heat that surrounded them, trying to steal the very warmth of their blood. They huddled around the central blaze, a furious, hungry thing consuming the last of their precious scavenged fuel. Flames roared, casting dancing, deceptive shadows that seemed to promise salvation. But the promise was a brutal, flickering lie wrapped in light. Kalen watched the faces of his men, pale, drawn, their breath turning instantly to ghostly plumes of ice crystals that vanished into the darkness like dissolving spirits. He felt the heat on his front, a fierce, almost scalding sensation, but his back, His back was already becoming a slab of ice. The heat was rising vertically, a golden column of energy soaring uselessly toward the stars, while the air around their feet, the critical layer protecting their vital organs, remained stagnant, heavy, and lethally frigid. This was the terrifying physics of the high cold, magnified 1,000 times. At sea level, air held heat like a thick, comforting blanket. Here, 15,000 feet closer to the ultimate void, the atmosphere was a sieve, leaking warmth into the cosmos without resistance, turning their bodies into high-altitude heat exchangers. They were radiating energy outward, straight through the sparse air, directly into the infinite coldness of space. The process accelerated by the lack of insulating density. The fire was not battling the local cold. It was trying, foolishly, to heat the universe. And the universe was winning, silently and implacably.
Every intake of breath was a microdose of chilling poison, freezing their lungs from the inside out, forcing their bodies to expend critical calories just to warm the meager oxygen they managed to extract from the hostile air. "The fire is our enemy," Kalen's voice ripped through the deepening cold, raw and desperate, an echo of his profound realization. The men looked up, confusion freezing their features into masks of dread and exhaustion.
It is a beacon. It draws us close, promises life, but it fails to contain the life we already possess. We are fighting the cold from the outside, but the true battle must be waged from within, locking down our internal energy. He knew the layers of wool and hides, thick as they were already saturated with the day's sweat and moisture, and now that moisture was turning into a skin of internal ice, slowly pulling the heat away through insidious conductive transfer, bypassing the insulating layers entirely. He needed a seal. He needed a thermal lock to defeat the vertical escape of heat and the horizontal assault of the freezing air. His eyes scanned the miserable campsite, settling on the only material that offered any hope against the plateau's weaponized climate: the ground itself. The earth, even frozen solid, held the faintest residual memory of the sun's afternoon kiss. "Dig, now. We dig into the earth," he commanded, seizing a sharpened stone tool, his mind racing to construct a new, impossible shelter before rigor mortis set in on his own crew, claiming them one by one. The task was monumental, bordering on suicide. The ground was not soil. It was permafrost, rock-hard and unforgiving, resisting their frantic, weakened efforts with brutal finality. Each chip, each shard of frozen earth dislodged, cost them a calorie they absolutely could not afford to lose. They were building a narrow trench, a shallow grave that they hoped, impossibly, would become their womb. The plan was terrifyingly simple. Get below the wind line, get below the main cold air mass, and then, most crucially, cover the top to create a thermal pocket. They were trying to create an artificial cave, reversing the natural flow of energy and humidity.
By lying low and covering the opening with stretched hides and the thickest wool blankets, they could trap the heat rising from their own bodies, preventing it from immediately escaping. It was the combined mass of the human body, not the failing, wasteful fire, that had to become the primary heat source. They had to become biological furnaces, sealed within a crude earthen oven against the vacuum of the night. But the digging was agonizing, a torture test of endurance and will. Minutes stretched into hours that felt like lifetimes, each shovel stroke a battle against the plateau's structural integrity and their own fading strength. One of the younger men, Tenzin, suddenly slumped forward, his face hitting the frozen dirt with a sickening thud that echoed in the silence. Hypoxia, compounded by the extreme physical exertion, had claimed him, not to mention the swift early stages of catastrophic localized cooling and exhaustion. Kalen roared, adrenaline surging through his own starved veins. He didn't check for a pulse. He couldn't afford the luxury of grief or verification. He dragged the limp body into the nascent trench, a gruesome testament to the price of slowing down even for a moment. "He is the first warmth," Kalen yelled, a brutal, practical truth that shocked the remaining men back into action, focusing their terror. Finish the roof, seal it against the sky. They worked with the terror of Tenzin's stillness spurring them on, pulling the heavy, rigid hides over the trench opening, overlapping them with careful, trembling fingers that were already losing sensation. The remaining fire, still burning outside, now felt distant, irrelevant, a mocking spectator to their subterranean desperation. They were sealing themselves in darkness, in a cramped, airless hole, trading the visible, immediate danger of the extreme cold for the unseen menace of suffocating air and climbing humidity. They were packed shoulder to shoulder, generating collective, desperate heat, their breath mingling in a steaming cloud. The air immediately grew thick, heavy with carbon dioxide and condensation, already threatening suffocation. But for the first time since the sun vanished, Kalen felt the internal temperature stabilize. They were defying the plateau, not with external fire, but with strategic enclosure. They had built a tiny, fragile bubble of humanity, an insulated pocket of resistance against the murderous astronomical cold. But now, the second stage of the deadly game began. The battle for the vanishing air and the management of deadly moisture. The trap was sprung, and they were sealed inside it. The cold had been a roaring lion, demanding attention, visible in the frosted breath and the splintering ice. But the lack of oxygen, the true apex predator of the high peaks, was a ghost. It didn't roar, it simply erased your mind, one agonizing synapse at a time, until you forgot how to survive. This was the altitude where the atmosphere itself turned traitor, abandoning those who dared to trespass. Every breath they dragged into their lungs felt like trying to suck life through a pinhole, a shallow, agonizing reminder that the world was running out of air just for them. The true horror of the plateau was not the cold that burned the skin, but the air that starved the brain, forcing them into a slow,
conscious suffocation. The nights became a horrifying ballet of broken sleep, marked by the distinctive, chilling rhythm of Cheyne-Stokes' respiration. One moment, a panicked gasp, hauling air. The next, a terrifying, silent pause, where the body simply forgot its fundamental contract with life.
They would wake in sheer terror, convinced they had died in their sleep, only to realize the thin air was playing a cruel game, offering just enough oxygen to understand the danger, but never enough to escape the grasp of the sickness. Headaches pounded behind their eyes like captured birds trying to escape the skull, driving spikes of pain into every waking moment.
Nausea coiled in the stomach, a deadly signal that their brains were slowly suffocating beneath the weight of the immense elevation. Every tiny effort, lifting a heavy skin cloak, stirring the meager fire, demanded a catastrophic metabolic price, burning the limited oxygen reserves at an unsustainable rate. They were functionally drowning on dry land, their muscles demanding more oxygen than the entire atmosphere could provide. But the silent air thief was not their only executioner. The moment they exerted themselves, even slightly, to maintain the perimeter fire or adjust their crude shelter, another enemy emerged, perhaps the most insidious of all: the wet. Sweat, the body's natural cooling mechanism, was now a fatal mistake, a self-sabotage engineered by the environment itself. In the deadly deep freeze of the plateau, that moisture didn't evaporate. It migrated, soaking into the inner layers of their animal hides and coarse wool. This internal dampness became a ticking clock, a fuse already lit. As soon as they stopped moving, the astronomical cold outside would instantly meet the internal moisture, turning the soaked fibers into microscopic shards of ice, welding the clothing directly to their skin. It was hyperthermia's dark mirror, freezing them solid from the inside out, using their own body heat against them. They had layered their furs thick, believing weight equaled warmth, a fatal miscalculation at this elevation. The heavy yak hides, while initially protective, trapped the lethal moisture close to the body, accelerating the internal freeze and guaranteeing the onset of deep, crippling hypothermia. The ancient wisdom of the plains was utterly worthless here. They needed air gaps. They needed materials that pushed the water away from the skin, not absorbed it. A concept utterly alien to their 300 BCE world. There was no synthetic wicking technology, only animal fiber and the unforgiving laws of physics. Survival now depended on revolutionary, immediate material science. They began the agonizing process of separating their layers every few hours, using the fleeting, low-output fire to bake the moisture out of the innermost clothes. This required them to expose the rest of their core, momentarily, to the full, murderous fury of the exterior cold. This wasn't rest. It was a deadly, exhausting ritual that consumed the very hours they needed for recovery. Holding a piece of damp, freezing wool near the weak flame, turning it constantly, fighting the temptation to scorch the material just to speed up the drying. It was a battle of nerves against the inevitable.
If they failed to dry the garments completely, even a slight trace of residual moisture, they were signing their own death warrants for the next shift. That dampness would turn their protective layers into rigid, crystalline suits of armor, guaranteeing catastrophic core temperature drop when the sun dipped below the horizon again. One wrong move, one moment of true exhaustion leading to sleep with damp clothes, and the mountain would claim them swiftly, embalming them in ice before the sun even dared to show its face again. The margin for error was now thinner than the very air they breathed, and the energy required to stay dry was draining their life force faster than the cold itself. The lack of oxygen began to warp their perception of reality. Simple tasks became monumental cognitive puzzles, requiring agonizing focus. The fire seemed to wink out faster than it should. The shadows stretched and moved with unnerving speed, feeding the paranoia that gripped them all. Survival was no longer about brute strength. It was about maintaining a level of relentless, paranoid vigilance, fueled by a brain starved for oxygen and rest. They were fighting two simultaneous wars: the external struggle against the cosmic cold, and the internal betrayal of their own bodies, which were actively trying to sweat themselves to death in the frozen wasteland. The plateau didn't just kill you. It drove you insane first, ensuring you were too confused, too exhausted, and too waterlogged to fight back when the final, deep blue chill arrived. They were sealed in the trap, the air vanishing, the dampness rising, and the pressure building to an inescapable, deadly climax. The blue chill that descended upon them was not merely cold. It was a hungry, weaponized emptiness, designed to strip heat faster than any living organism could generate it. They realized the horrifying truth. The fire, their supposed savior, was actually compounding the danger by filling the cramped shelter with warm, saturated air. This humid breath, meeting the walls of the shelter that were already approaching absolute zero, condensed immediately, turning every thread of yak wool insulation into a conductive conduit for death. Every frantic, gasping exhalation added another layer of icy moisture, transforming their protective gear into heat-leaching sponges. They were drowning in their own breath, sealed in a trap where the insulation that should have saved them was actively murdering them through the catastrophic physics of latent heat transfer. Kalen, his mind racing against the clock of certain death, watched the ice crystals form on the inside of his nostrils and understood the betrayal. The enemy was not just the outside cold. The enemy was water vapor, the invisible assassin that stole energy exponentially faster than simple conduction. When that vapor condensed and froze within the fiber structure, the insulating power of the wool dropped by nearly 90%. This was instantaneous, radical heat loss that defied their desperate, failing attempts to stoke the meager embers of the wood they had hauled up the deadly slopes. They needed a new law of physics, a way to divorce their own biological function from the lethal environment. The answer arrived not in fire,
but in sealing. They had to stop the internal moisture from ever reaching the outer insulation layer. Desperate, they reached for the most pliable, waterproof material they possessed, the dried membranes of animal bladders, typically used for carrying water across the dry lands.
These delicate, paper-thin sheets were immediately and agonizingly stitched together, forming a crude, sticky second skin worn directly beneath their existing heavy layers. It was counterintuitive, feeling clammy and hot against the skin initially, trapping the body's moisture against them.
But that contained moisture, now prevented from evaporating into the cold air layers, stabilized the temperature immediately adjacent to their skin. The bladder membrane became a crucial vapor barrier, a physiological shield against the internal betrayal of their own metabolism, ensuring that the heavy wool layers remained bone dry and maximally effective. This was the first revolutionary step, but the plateau demanded redundancy. The cold was a persistent predator, finding the slightest flaw. They realized that their reliance on heavy, compressible layers was another fatal error. When they moved or shifted, the wool compressed, crushing the pockets of air that did the actual insulating work. To counteract this, they began weaving baskets, not for carrying goods, but for wearing. They meticulously crafted rigid vests and sleeves from tough, thin reed grass, creating structured, uncollapsible cages worn between the vapor barrier and the outer heavy cloak. These reed cages were the architectural key to survival. They held open a crucial, permanent layer of dead air space, a static, motionless layer of gas that is the single most effective insulator known to physics. This dead air, held rigid and uncompressed, could not be defeated by movement or pressure. They were wearing tiny, personal thermal domes, structures designed to maintain separation and stability. The first night they wore this horrific, ingenious armor was the true test. The sun vanished, and the temperature instantly plummeted into the zones where life ceases to exist. They sat huddled, feeling the freezing air screaming around their heads, their fingers already sluggish with hypoxia. The initial shivering was a psychological echo of previous terror. But then, the deep-seated, organ-freezing ache that always signaled the onset of hypothermia failed to arrive. They felt the cold, yes, but the thermal transfer was arrested, halted by the reed cages and the bladder skin. The plateau was denied its heat tribute. They had tricked the environment's fundamental laws. They had turned flimsy reeds and waste material into the scaffold of their continued existence. The silence of the lethal night was no longer the sound of impending death, but the sound of an enemy defeated, temporarily paralyzed by human ingenuity.
The small, carefully managed fire now served merely as a psychological comfort and a source of dry heat for the shelter walls, not a desperate, failing defense. They had survived the night, the most catastrophic test the plateau could offer, but their victory was brittle. Dawn arrived not as a promise of relief, but as the harbinger of a new cataclysmic threat. The thin, high atmosphere that failed to hold heat at night
was now failing to block the sun's pure, unfiltered radiation during the day.
The plateau never rests. If the night was the weapon of conduction and evaporation, the day was the weapon of radiation and desiccation. They faced a rapid, brutal switch from freezing to baking, threatening to shatter every fragile equilibrium they had just established, demanding yet another impossible adaptation. The sun did not rise on the plateau, it exploded. It wasn't a gentle illumination, but a sudden, blinding detonation of white-hot radiation that instantly weaponized the atmosphere against them, switching their battle from the deep freeze to the searing oven in the span of a single, agonizing breath. They had defeated the ice demon of the night, using painstaking, layered heat traps and controlled flame. But now they faced the solar god, who wielded an invisible, lethal fire, far more insidious than frostbite. This was not merely warmth. This was a focused, high-intensity assault designed to cook the moisture out of their very bones, leaving them desiccated husks kneeling in the thin air. The temperature differential, the brutal, chaotic swing from 30 degrees below freezing before dawn to rapidly approaching 20 degrees Celsius in direct sunlight, was enough to shatter glass, let alone the fragile biochemistry of the human body clinging desperately to life. They were plunged into a thermal torture chamber, oscillating wildly between hypothermia and hyperthermia within the same 24-hour cycle. At this extreme altitude, the protective blanket of the atmosphere had been violently peeled away, leaving them exposed to ultraviolet radiation levels that were medically obscene, multiplying the danger factor by a shocking 5 or even 6 times that of the lowlands, where civilization thrived. The air itself, devoid of moisture, refused to act as a thermal buffer, meaning the heat they absorbed was immediate, punishing, and trapped beneath the heavy animal hides they still needed to wear as insulation against the inevitable, lurking patches of lethal shadow. They were trapped in a cruel paradox. Strip off the layers, and the solar radiation would burn their skin to weeping blisters, inducing catastrophic fluid loss that no human body could sustain at this altitude. Keep the layers on, and the interior of their meager shelters became impromptu sweat lodges, accelerating dehydration to critical, deadly speeds. Every drop of sweat was a priceless commodity, leaking away into the thirsty, unforgiving void of the sky, dragging essential salts and electrolytes with it, plunging them towards muscle spasms, profound weakness, and total systemic collapse within hours. They were drinking their own lifeblood. Their ancient knowledge of material science, usually focused only on trapping heat for the brutal nights, was now catastrophically insufficient. They had to invent the science of selective thermal rejection under immediate duress, or perish. They realized the thick yak hides, their salvation in the darkness, were now their jailers, soaking up radiant energy like massive black sponges and holding that furnace heat directly against their skin, accelerating the internal temperature rise to dangerous thresholds. The solution wasn't subtraction, it was precise, deliberate modification. The remaining hides were brutally, methodically lacerated, not cut randomly, but scored with microscopic, deliberate perforations using sharpened bone tools honed by the desperation of their need. This revolutionary modification created hundreds of tiny, one-way thermal vents across the surface of their garments, allowing superheated, moisture-laden air to escape from the inner microclimate, while the heavy hide still maintained its primary function as a physical barrier against the direct, scorching UV light. They were engineering the first known active cooling survival suit in human history, a primitive, desperate application of thermal dynamics, born not of academic genius, but of the pure, unfiltered, primal terror of dying from their own body heat. But venting only delayed the inevitable, the brutal, mathematical certainty of dehydration. They were losing water faster than they could possibly replenish it. Even with the meticulous ice melting operation they had perfected during the relative calm of the night. Every sip of water, painstakingly melted over hours from rock-hard chunks of glacial ice and stored carefully in bladder pouches, felt like pouring liquid gold into a bottomless pit, a temporary, minute reprieve against a thirst that gnawed at their throats like grit and fire. The process of collecting fuel, already a monumental task in the oxygen-starved environment, was now compounded by the need to manage solar exposure. Every movement was a critical calculation. Is this necessary heat expenditure worth the water it will cost me? They began moving like spectral figures during the peak solar hours, hugging the shadow lines of the few exposed rock formations, recognizing that exposure was a currency of life they could no longer afford to spend frivolously.
The high-altitude cerebral edema and pulmonary edema, the silent executioners of the plateau, weren't just waiting, they were amplified by the fluid loss. Dehydration thickened the blood, making the heart hammer even harder against the crushing resistance of the thin air.
Blurred vision, crippling headaches that felt like hammers hitting the inside of their skulls, and a deepening, terrifying confusion began to settle over the group, making logical thought a luxury they could ill afford in this lethal, unforgiving pressure cooker of sun and altitude. They were hallucinating, seeing shimmering mirages of flowing rivers in the dry, cracked earth, hearing whispers in the wind that promised relief if they would only just rest for a moment. Seductive lies designed to lure them into fatal inertia and slumber. This was the plateau's masterstroke, attacking them with heat and dehydration, knowing that the resulting physiological collapse would make them easy prey for the altitude sickness they had temporarily held at bay with grit and pure will. They had overcome the cold, they had mitigated the heat, but the ground beneath their feet was now revealed to be the next insidious layer of the trap. The dark, rocky surface, heated relentlessly by the high-intensity sun, began radiating heat upward, turning their few remaining scraps of bedding and their feet into slow-roasting targets. They needed an insulating layer to defy the physics of conduction, something that could separate them from the murderous thermal energy rising from the earth itself,
something impossible to find in this desolate wasteland. They looked at the sparse, yellowed, brittle grasses, realizing the desperate final resource they would have to exploit.
Their next great, impossible challenge was to harvest this meager insulation under the full, unyielding wrath of the solar god, risking immediate sunstroke and total dehydration for the meager chance of a few square feet of thermal separation from the murderous earth. The battle for the surface had begun, and the clock was ticking down to zero on their remaining moisture reserves, threatening to end their journey not in the deep freeze, but in a slow, agonizing roast.